Thank you so much for your welcome. And thank you to the British Council, and thank you to Garage for the opportunity to come here. I'm ashamed to say it's my first visit to Russia ever. Terrible. But that just makes me all the happier to be here now. When we were setting up this talk, I had two different conversations with British Council, and one of which they suggested that I talk about my my development, the development of my career as a curator, the challenges, the lessons that I'd learned, and so on, how I came to be doing what I'm doing now. And then I had another conversation in which I discovered that Garage is planning its own triennial to start in 2020, and that it might be appropriate for me to talk about Folkstone Triennial, which is one of my current jobs. And so I'm afraid you're going to get both talks. You're going to get me talking about my development. You're also going to get. So I will try not to make it too long. We have. It's very important that we have time to talk. Some question time at the end. But forgive me if I go quite fast because there's a lot to cover. Welcome. So. My name is Lewis Biggs. I'm an independent curator. I studied history initially. But my main interest at that time was in poetry, contemporary poetry. So I like to set up poetry readings by contemporary poets. And the only place there was to make these poetry readings was in the local museum. And so I started to spend a lot of time at the museum. And I spent time reading the books in the museum bookstall, and they got to know me pretty well because I couldn't afford to buy the books. I was still a student, but they noticed that I was there all the time and that I knew their books very well. Eventually, they offered me a job. So that was my first job in the museum world as a result of being interested in poetry. I bothered to tell you that because I'm a lucky person. I've always done what I wanted to do, and somehow or other, I made enough money to continue to do what I wanted to do, and that's still what I'm doing. I make money by doing what I love to do, so I'm a very lucky man. In the museum. I spent my apprenticeship as an exhibition organizer. We weren't called curators in those days. It was about organizing exhibitions. And I learned to do that by being a technician, by selling postcards, by sitting in the gallery talking to the public when they came in, by helping with school children when they came in, by doing all the things that a curator needs to do. In my view, organizing exhibitions and being a curator are about knowing who your audience is. That's the most important qualification for a curator or an exhibition organizer. Of course, after a while, in that kind of apprenticeship, I realized that I needed to know something about the history of art, and so I did a postgraduate degree in the history of art. And I was then lucky enough to get work organizing exhibitions straight away. History is about imagining how other people think, and looking at art can also change the way that people think or people feel. And so I think that for me, the movement between being a historian and being involved with contemporary art was the recognition that art is an instrument for thinking and feeling. And it's that has always motivated me. All of you who are involved with art know that artists need their work to be validated. Somebody else has to tell the artist that it's worth continuing doing what they're doing. And there are two main ways art is validated. One is through the market. You sell your work. If you keep on selling it, you know it's worth doing. The other is if somebody writes about it. And I call this the academic validation. Somebody, a critic or an author, writes about your work, and your work enters into a critical discourse of some kind. And regardless of whether you manage to sell the work or not, this is a way of validating your practice as an artist. So those are the two ways, main ways that art is validated, and both of them, you notice, depend not on the artist; they depend on the viewer. The artist is not in control of their own work. Artists like to think they're in control of their own work sometimes, but actually, whether art lives or dies is not a matter for the artist; it's a matter for the audience. Well, to cut a long story short, in 1990 I became director of Tate Gallery in Liverpool. This was and I remained director of Tate Gallery for 10 years, 1990 to 2000. And during that time, in 2000, we opened Tate Modern in London. And Tate Modern was a museum of modern and contemporary art. But during those 10 years, 1990 to 2000, Tate Liverpool was the only dedicated museum of modern and contemporary art in England. And so it was like an experiment. And in fact, many of the lessons that we learned in the experiment in Liverpool then went on to be incorporated into the way that Tate Modern operated when it opened. But during that time, I became very interested, during those 10 years, I became very interested in how contemporary international, modernist and contemporary international art is received by its audience, how it becomes validated by its audience, how meaning is given to the art. I mean, of course, I'd always been interested in that, but having to be director of a museum that was also an experiment was very challenging from that point of view. There was a history of exhibiting contemporary art in Liverpool, previous to Tate Liverpool opening there, fortunately. So we were able to build on some tradition of acceptance of contemporary art, but it wasn't easy. But I have to say that during those 10 years as a museum director, I began to see that there was a problem with the system of validation of art through either the market or people writing about art. And there was also a problem with the system of galleries and museums. And in particular, I became disenchanted with artists who made their work for the museum. And I was using this analogy just a moment ago to somebody who was talking to me. It's like art in the museum is like wildlife in the zoo. It's great to have the wildlife brought to you in the zoo and to be able to read the label about what it is, to read about its natural habitat, to read, to know what it eats and all the rest of it. But in the end, you're seeing something which is not living the full life that it might lead if it were somewhere else. For me, art lives best if it's free in society, outside the museum, not within the framework of the museum, or even necessarily within the framework of the convention of art. So that's a big statement, and it's my personal hobby horse, but I'm very interested in taking art outside the museum and putting it into a context which brings all of contemporary life to bear on that artwork, rather than wrapping it in the cotton wool of art history and the art museum. So during those 10 years, 1990 to 2000, I started to organize exhibitions outside the museum to see how art could stand up to what one might call real life. And a particularly important project for me was called Art TransPennine. TransPennine 98. We started organizing it in 1995, and it was and the exhibition happened in 1998. And it was here is Liverpool, and here is Hull on the other side of England, from one coast to the other, and we arranged this exhibition at 30 different locations across the country, from Liverpool to Hull, and we commissioned 40 artists to make new artworks, all new. Maybe half of them were shown outdoors, and half of them were shown in galleries and museums. The exhibition was a terrible failure. The art was wonderful, the artists did a great job, but nobody went to see it. Asking people to travel to see art was too much. People in the north of England at that time were very unused to seeing their own country, to traveling about in their own country. They were not used to traveling across the country like this. And so very, very few people, I mean maybe a handful of people, actually saw the whole exhibition. Many more people saw individual artworks within it, and some of those artworks were very well appreciated. But it was a very bad idea for an exhibition. That's where it is in England, the top band there. And this was one of the maps which we used, which, as you can see, is quite complicated. I mean, it was over complex as an idea. But I mention it because it was kind of it was an attempt to use a region as a gallery. You know, every curator who uses a gallery to show art knows that different places in the gallery mean different things depending on the history of what else has been put in the different rooms, the way that people behave in any space is always coded, so that you walk into a space and then you turn left or you turn right or you look for the light or whatever it is. The way that people behave in a space matters enormously for the way in which they experience the art in the space. And so that contextualization of the artwork by the art gallery, even if there's no other art in the art gallery, is an important consideration for a curator. So we were attempting, I say we, I organized this exhibition with my good friend Robert Hopper, who unfortunately died soon afterwards. But we wanted to use this entire region as a gallery, to use the knowledge, the context of that gallery to give the artworks that we placed there context and meaning for the people who experienced them. It was so that was a significant moment for me, and in a way I've been trying to do the same thing ever since. So I've told you now, that's it. In 1998, I was also a founder of the Liverpool Biennial. That's to say, this last slide is a picture of reality. This is the reality of the region between Liverpool and Hull. It's full of this kind of visual mess. And it's a very, very hard environment for art. You have to be a very brave artist to take it on. Not many artists are brave enough to do that. But sometimes you can have incredible success by taking on the challenge. So, Liverpool Biennial, we founded it in 1998. While I was still director of Tate Liverpool, we set up an organisation. I was a trustee. We employed a wonderful chief curator from Sydney called Tony Bond, who selected the first, selected the artists and the artworks for the first biennial, which took place in 1999. And he did a fantastic job. And he went home with his address book, and in early 2000, the spring of 2000, we sat around looking at each other and wondering, was that our biennial? It's come and gone. What have we got left? And we realized that it's a fundamental mistake to employ a curator who doesn't live in the place where your biennial takes place, because there is no investment in the continuing development of art in your place unless the curator lives there. Is anyone from Garage listening? I'm expressing my own views, of course. But we were struck by the contrast between the brilliant job that Tony did but there was no ongoing development from his. He had had the relationship with the artists. He had the relationship with their dealers, if there was a relationship. The shape of the exhibition was in his mind. If any of you are curators and you have hosted an exhibition that someone else has organized, you know that it's not the same thing as organizing it yourself. There can't be so much commitment. There can't be so much discussion with the public. There can't be so much engagement by the public with something that has been organized 4,000 miles away. It doesn't make sense. So we took the decision at that moment to change the format of the biennial and not make a biennial in the way in which so many other biennials continue to be made. The biennial was also more than £1 million in debt at the time, and I realized that I'd become more committed to the future of the biennial than I was to the future of the Tate, or rather, well, I knew the Tate could look after itself. And so I resigned as director of Tate in order to take on being the chief executive and artistic director of Liverpool Biennial. And we remodeled the way in which the biennial operated in many ways as a direct result of the experience of art TransPennine. So we decided that the second biennial, which took place in 2002, was going to be curated entirely by local curators. Why not? They happened to live in Liverpool, but they were international curators like all curators are. I mean, there were curators at the Tate, there were curators at the Walker Art Gallery, curators at the Blue Coat Art Gallery. These are art galleries with well-established curators who've done a lot of traveling, who know artists from different countries. What's wrong with local curators making a show? Still an international show. So we decided, first of all, that it would be organized by local curators. Secondly, that we would commission all new work. It's a very expensive thing to do, but we thought that it was better to have fewer artists and have new work than more artists and take work from artist studios. Why? Because if an artist is making a new piece of work for a particular time and place, they are more likely to think hard about who is going to see it. And the audience can feel this. The audience knows very well if a work has been made for them or has been made in the studio to sell in the sales room. It's a different thing. The second, so 2002 Biennial, I think there were between 25 and 30 artists, very few artists, but it was all new work, and a significant proportion of it, maybe 10 artworks, were out of doors, in the street, not in the museum. Now, that's an expensive thing to do, also. But I have to say we had an extremely positive experience from it. We'd already learned a bit about how to do this from Art TransPennine. And so the next 5 biennials, Liverpool biennials, really made a virtue of showing out of doors, additionally to showing artworks in gallery and museum spaces. I'll show you. In 2007, we asked an architectural practice called Gross Max, based in Edinburgh, to help us with this patch of ground. The building on the right there is a community college. It's an further education community college. In front of it, there was a patch of waste ground on which there were burnt-out cars, mattresses, shopping trolleys. So the people who came and went from the further education college were faced every time they came or went with this scene of complete dereliction in front of them, where there had previously been terraced houses. I mean, a lot of houses in Liverpool have been knocked down. And Kirkdale is a place where there is very little employment within Liverpool. So basically the idea, Gross Max's idea, was to turn the entire space into a community garden, to get local people to plant flowers and to contribute to it what they call their folly, which is this iron construction made of iron grid, rusty iron grid, and to basically just to green the space. But the key idea was to get local people, neighbours, to participate in the planting and the care of the space. And as you can see, there's still some rubbish. This is after rather than before, and there's still some rubbish there, but at least there are no burnt-out cars. And local people took to it very well and became very proud of it. And I've used this particular example. This is the only example of an artwork from Liverpool Biennial that I'm going to talk about today. Because it's about green space. And green space in the city is extremely important. And I didn't realize before coming here tonight that we are in Gorky Park. but that's very relevant to my talk because the way in which a park is used by anybody says a lot about the city and the population and the behavioral habits of the people in that population. Whether they use it constructively or destructively. I mean, some people go to a park in order to wreck the rubbish bins or draw graffiti on the on the sidewalks. Other people go to the park in order to have a picnic or engage in conversation with strangers or to walk the dog or whatever it happens to be. So, but a green space in a city is always potentially a private space. It's also potentially a public space, and the making public of a space is a very important part of the development of civic society. Sorry, that's a fairly large statement, but there's a motif underneath my experience and what I'm talking about tonight, which is about the link between the making of a public for an artwork. As I started by saying, art exists through its public. So art needs to have a public made for it. And that process is analogous to the making of a community, people who share something in common, who understand the world from a particular point of view. So you can see the construction of public space, sometimes through the creation of a piece of public art, can in turn begin to build the blocks of civic society. This is what I believe, and this is why I'm engaged in public art in China and why I'm engaged in public art in Folkestone. No matter where you are in the world, I think the value of social interaction and sharing cultural values is worth defending and propagating. So, Start with the Park was the name of a book published in England in about 2008, and starting with the park is a great idea if in urbanism, if you can get the park right, then a lot of other things follow. Folkstone. After 10 years at the Biennial, I decided it was time to move on. My children had grown up and left. I was in Liverpool for 25 years. My children were born there and left home from there. And so I was able to see them grow up, go to school, go off to university, leave home. And throughout that 25 years, I was able to relate to the people of Liverpool through my children's friends, through meeting their parents at the school gates or whatever it was. I was a part of that community for those years. And if I was able to do anything as a curator, it was because I knew that community and was able to bring the right art to that community because I knew it. The job of the curator is to know the audience. Folkestone's a very small place, 45,000, 50,000 people, with about 150,000 in the immediate district. This is the old town. You can see the railway station. You can see the port down here. This area in orange is an area that used to support the port. After the Channel Tunnel was built and the port became disused, I'm sorry, I should have said, Folkestone is on the extreme bottom right-hand corner of England. It's the nearest bit of England to France. And consequently, it was a very important point of embarkation from England to go to France, or inward migration if you're coming from France to England. When Paris and London were the kind of two capitals of the 19th century, there was a lot of toing and froing between London and Paris, and Folkestone benefited from that. When the Channel Tunnel was built, the port collapsed because people no longer came through Folkestone as a port. The orange area used to be the part of town that supported the port most directly, and so in 2004, 10 years after the Channel Tunnel was built, this part of Folkestone was empty. I mean, a lot of empty buildings. A local businessman bought them, refurbished them, and gave them to a foundation called Creative Foundation. Creative Foundation lets them to creative people, so artists and graphic designers and IT creatives and animators and so on. So it's live-work space for creative people, and it's now called the Creative Quarter in Folkstone. And the idea is that the rent that comes in from those properties comes back to the Creative Foundation. The Creative Foundation spends it on art programming, including the Triennial. It also runs a book festival and a theatre and other things, but the Triennial is one of the main artistic outputs of Creative Foundation, supported by the creative community that live and work in this area. So this is a very interesting regenerative model, but it depends on there being a businessman or woman who wants to put money back into the town where they grew up and where their workforce lived. It was quite a common thing in the 19th century, less common in the 20th century. I'm the lucky beneficiary that that we have such a man in Folkestone now. For those of you who are interested in regeneration, creativity and regeneration, I want to point out that this model has been very consciously developed as a producer model rather than a consumer model. So there are towns where you build a gallery in order to attract tourism, in order to regenerate the economy. That's very normal in many, many parts of the world. Roger De Haan, the businessman we're talking about here, decided early on that he wanted to take a different view. He wanted to go for producer-led regeneration. So he wanted to he didn't want to build a museum. He wanted to build creative work spaces and living spaces to attract people who do things. He wanted to attract producers into the town, many of whom would also be small businesses and sell their work or whatever. So it's not ruling out consumption, it's just being led by production rather than being led by consumption. So it's not about tourism. Tourists come because they want to buy what the artists have made. But it isn't about tourism, it's about providing facility for creative producers. And 10 years on, because now this Creative Quarter has been running for 10 years, it's very successful. There are no unlet properties. The properties are let for very slightly subsidized rate, but actually they're just about the same rental value as places outside the Creative Quarter. So this is my canvas. This is the town. This is my gallery. This is where I place art. I have got to know most of the streets in this town so that I know something about their story. I know something about their physical characteristics, because places are made of stories and materials. I mean, it's history and geography. I've really enjoyed the little that I've seen of Moscow so far, because it has such great history and such great geography, and these are readable. You can walk into the town and you can read these things in the building and the layout of the streets and the river and the relation between the river and the bridges and the hills and the, it's all there. You can read it. And it's the same in Folkestone. You can read the history and the geography very easily. And that's what makes a good place to live in. And I think it's interesting that art is made the same way. Artists make objects and tell stories about them. It's a mixture between narrative and form. Generally speaking, artists make a form and then they tell us a story, which is the sales pitch, or it's the narrative. We can also supply our own narrative to that form. And if art is very good in its form, then it will inspire a great many different narratives from us. We complete the artwork started by the artist. So the process by which places are made and by which art is made are analogous. Again, there's the same way. So people ask me, why do you involve artists with urbanism? What has urbanism got to do with artists? To me, it's very clear. Artists already have the skills to contribute because they know how to put forms and narratives together. I mean, forgive me if this is kind of seems very dumb to you, but I continue to marvel at it. The fact that our cities, and some of them are really, really terrible, some of them are disastrous, have been made consciously by human beings. Like bees make beehives or whatever. We know about the bee because we can read the bee's behavior from the beehive through the honeycomb and all the rest of it. And we can read the behavior of human beings from the cities which we make. And isn't it a disaster very often? I mean, I spend time in China and in Korea, and there are places there where I would not wish anybody to visit, let alone live. Prisons. But they have been consciously designed to be prisons by somebody. And the behavior that they require of us in order to live in them is prison-like. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but people, because I've always been involved with art and only relatively recently admitted that I'm involved with urbanism, people sometimes say, why do you get involved with urbanism? But for me, urbanism, well, as I mentioned earlier, it's the same kind of process as art. But anybody who's interested in humanity has to be interested in cities. Most of us live in cities, and many cities are horrible places to live and getting worse and need something to be done about it. And that means I should do something about it as much as anybody else should do something about it. Places that look terrible damage the people who live there. I mean, my children walked to school in Liverpool down streets that were boarded up. That's the terraced housing, that all the houses were empty, and so the windows and doors had been screwed shut with plates of metal. Street after street of deserted, empty houses. How does that affect a child? What does that say about humanity and how and what future you can expect? It's not mine. So I care about urbanism because I think it's a really important question in front of all of us. So I'm going to talk about our art commissions in Folkestone at last. This is a map from the Triennial that just ended in 2017, and this here is a list of artworks that are still in place from previous triennials. So some of the artworks that are commissioned for the triennial stay in place after the exhibition finishes and become part of, as it were, the town's collection of artworks. And these ones here were the artworks that were commissioned specifically for 2017, some of which will stay behind. So there will be around 40 artworks in the collection when we announce that later this year. And the first artwork, I want to start with the park, as I mentioned before, with Liverpool. There is this little patch of green in the middle of the creative quarter, which was wasteland. It was a place where people could take their dogs, where drug dealers went at night, where it's a space in which there were many different interest groups around. So there was an old people's home at the top. There was a school, which you can, this blue building is a school. There's a theatre. There are different businesses. The street at the bottom is inhabited mainly by Roma people, immigrants who don't have English as a language, and who live in privately rented accommodation, so that they are overcrowded basically, and so they use the park as a part of their living space because there isn't room indoors. And these different groups were not getting on with each other. They were frightened of each other. So the students in the school didn't want to eat their lunch in the park because they were frightened of the Roma kids. And the old people didn't want to come into the park because they didn't like the loud music played by the students in the school. And the people didn't want to come to the theatre and park their cars outside the theatre because they thought the Roma kids might scratch their cars. And the police didn't like the Roma kids because the Roma kids were dealing in drugs. And so on and so on. Everybody used the park, but for their own private purposes, and they resented other people being there. It's fairly normal, I think. But it's not helped by the fact that the park was overgrown and clearly not a public space. So we invited Muff Art and Architecture, who's a London-based firm a multidisciplinary firm, art and architecture, to come and look at it. Whoops. And what they started with some archaeology. they invited some of the people who live round about to dig to see what could be found. So this is a bit of archaeology going on, and you can see some of the Roma families looking at each other and looking at sizing up the other people. And then Muff organised pizza ovens so that people could, interest groups could each contribute their own pizzas, different cultural pizzas, as it were, and people could sample each other's pizzas. And then they organised silent disco so that people could try out different kinds of dancing. Old people, young people, and all. And during the process of getting the different interest groups engaged with each other, Muff came up with a new plan as to how to use the park, which was based on the idea that no space would be designated for any particular purpose. So it was designed with the most open possible interpretation, so that, for instance, well, the easiest way of talking about it is by negative. You know, if you buy a children's play park from a supplier of children's play parks, there is a swing which can't be used for anything other than swinging. There is a ramp that can't be used for anything other than sliding, because the manufacturers want you to buy as much equipment as possible, so the equipment is as specialized as possible. If it's specialized, it can only be used for one thing. You need to buy lots of equipment. If they sold you one multi-purpose thing, then you would only have to buy the one multi-purpose thing. But they're too clever for that. They want you to. So it was the same idea with this park. Muff designed all of it to be as open as possible, so that anybody could use it. So that the Roma kids and the old people could mingle together in the same physical space for different reasons, but in the same place. It's a little difficult to explain this without time-lapse photography showing how the same thing is used by different people at different times. But as you can see, there are these it's just material landscaping, but it's done in such a way that nothing is closed down. No interpretation is closed down. When we finally got to opening the park for the triennial, there was a good turnout of all the different interest groups who live around, and I'm happy to say, 3 years on, that the park is well used. The students from the school eat their lunch there now. The drug dealers have moved down the street somewhere else. It's become a public space. It's turned from being a space that was used for private purposes into a space that embraces different kinds of people. This is a lunch party that was held in the middle of the park at one point. So that's that's an example of starting with the park. What I call art-led urbanism. This next example is a much more conventional piece of public art. But I'm still waiting for the narrative to unfold. It's a piece of waste ground, again, in the middle of a neighborhood, which used to be a gasworks. It may still be toxic. We're not very sure whether the land is toxic or not. So I asked an artist called Jill Bradley to come and look at it to see if she could help detoxify it. using plants. She's a horticulturist as well as an artist. She knows about plants. So I was expecting her to come up with some proposal as to how to plant particular species which would help detoxify the area and allow it to become maybe a children's playground or whatever. What she actually came up with was this sculpture, and the disc, the circle of this sculpture is on where there used to be it's the footprint of a gasometer. You know, gasometers, this gas storage cylinders. That's a bit closer too, and you can see that the circle is filled by these upright green perspex and aluminium poles, but then there's also wooden poles in a square grid outside the circle, and these poles are hop poles. Hops are the fruit that you grow to put in beer. You know, it's fruit like grapes, but you dry it and then you put it in beer. Hops, and this part of Kent is a place where hops have always been grown. Now it turned out, I didn't know, but it turned out that Jill had spent a lot of her childhood in Folkestone and had spent her time wandering around local hop fields, and so she wanted to recreate the idea of hop fields. Anyhow, this artwork has been has enabled the people who live in the houses around. Incidentally, in this photo, you can see how close the hills are to Folkestone. It's really in a beautiful situation just within the North Downs. Putting the sculpture here allowed local people access into the gasworks. It allowed them to feel that the gasworks might become theirs. And 3 years on, we are still negotiating with the landlord, with the owner of the landowner, to take possession of the land in order for some kind of development to take place. We're hoping that there will be self-build houses on the space, built by local people who are currently renting and would like to build their own houses. I need to speed up because I've just realised I'm spending too much time. So I'll deal with this one very quickly. I mentioned earlier that we treat the town of Folkestone as if it were a gallery. Since I've been living half my time in Folkestone, a lot of people have asked me, why doesn't Folkestone have an art school? It doesn't have an art school. There are many places in England that don't have art schools. Many art schools have shut because everything's been centralised into universities. Folkestone used to have an art school. So I invited an artist called Bob and Roberta Smith to get involved with this question, why Folkestone doesn't have an art school. And he came back and said, well, actually Folkestone is an art school. It doesn't need an art school because it is an art school. So this is a bit like Folkestone doesn't need a museum because it is a museum. It doesn't need an art school because it is already an art school. In researching what the facilities for learning about art in Folkestone were, Bob and Roberta Smith came to the conclusion that all the facilities that you need for an art school were already there. There are teachers, there are artists, there are studios, there are places where students can meet and talk to each other, there are visiting lecturers, there is everything that an art school is composed of. It's just there isn't a piece of paper at the end of 3 years to tell you you're an artist. So this is at the main railway station. Bob and Roberta's proposal that Folkestone is an art school was a kind of provocation to to young people, why move away from Folkestone to get an art school education in London or Manchester or wherever, if you can actually stay at home and get one locally? It'll be a lot cheaper, and admittedly you won't get a piece of paper at the end of it, but which exhibition organizer or art gallery has ever asked to see an artist's certificate of having a degree? It doesn't happen. The problem with monetizing education is that it only works if the degree has monetary value, and an art degree has never had monetary value. So that's Folkestone as an art school. We also put, Bob and Roberta actually organised a lot of activity around this idea, but we're waiting to see now whether. But I enjoyed this work particularly, and I included it in this talk about art-led urbanism because I think it does change the way that people think about the town. Urbanism is about attitude and it's about behavior. And if people change their attitudes and behaviors, that will result in physical change to the town also. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if rethinking Folkestone as an art school doesn't result in some kind of physical change to Folkestone in the next few years. This one is more about geography. There is a river running. Folkestone is built around a river called River Pent. Well, it's a stream really rather than a river called the Pent, which flows into the sea where the harbour is. And two local artists, Diane Dever and Jonathan Wright, made me aware of this shortly after I arrived in Folkestone in 2012. These red lines are the lines of the River Pent, which is underground now. It's been culverted over, so you can't see it. It's been built over. But that business of hiding water happens in many cities, towns, and it destroys the sense of place because usually places are where they are because of water. So if you hide the water, it hides an important part of a place's narrative and history. Jonathan and Diane wanted to make an artwork to reveal or point to demonstrate where the water used to be, to remind people and bring back a sense of place to Folkestone, or a sense of rationale for place. And what they did is they produced a series of 5 water towers looking like this, which were meant to be reminiscent of New York water towers, as it were, which were placed down the length of the Pent stream. They're all different from each other, and they were collectively called Pent houses, because as you may know, a penthouse is a flat. Is the apartment that is more valuable than all the other apartments in any particular block. So it's a comment about real estate and the fact that water almost everywhere makes real estate more valuable. So if you can rediscover water, you can add value to real estate. So this is a plan for a new development. This is the cliff. So everything this side of the cliff used to be sea. When the harbour arm was built here, the mole to protect shipping, the prevailing current shifted stone pebbles against the harbour arm and built reclaimed land, created new land. When the harbour went broke, the person who bought the harbour also bought the beach because it belonged to the harbour. And so there's now a proposal to build all of this new housing here. All of that is proposed new development. And because it's by water, it should be quite valuable. This is a railway track on a viaduct which came down to here. So there's the main railway connection between London and Paris came through here, down that track. That track has not been used for 20 years or more. And in 2012, I invited Gabriel Lester, artist from Holland, to think about how to bring that track back into public use, not as a railway track, but as a pathway, as a pedestrian path or a cycle route, maybe. And as a first stage to its change of use, it was necessary to show people what it was, because it had been an area that was forbidden, trespass area. And his response was to build this bamboo sculpture, which allowed people to walk up these wooden steps onto the top of the platform and look up and down the viaduct. And that act of placing your own body on top of the viaduct affects your view of the world. You see the world differently by being 3 meters higher and in a different place. And you see how the viaduct connects one side of the harbour with the other side of the harbour, and the possibilities for pedestrian use. It was a beautiful sculpture in itself, but it performed this function of changing people's attitude and therefore their behaviour in relation to getting from one side of the harbour to the other. So this is called the inner harbour. This is called the outer harbour, and this is and this here is the beach, where holidaymakers build sandcastles with their children. And the two harbours have always been industrial. Let's say they were for poling and for ferries coming in and coming in and out, and for fishing boats. Since there are no longer any commercial shipping happening, this outer harbour here is very little used by. It is sometimes used by fishing boats, but it isn't used very much for anything. So it's sitting there as a kind of empty relic of Folkestone's industrial past, while the holidaymakers continue to enjoy themselves on the sand. We invited. That's another view of it, but you can see that actually this bit of sand here is rather beautiful and much nearer the town than the rest of the beach. Everything's very foreshortened in this image, but there's nothing wrong with the piece of beach in the outer harbour. So Michael Salesdorfer's proposal was to bury 30 pieces of gold, 30 pieces of gold, in the beach, along with a great many metal washers, so that people with metal detectors couldn't find the gold immediately. And we announced this at the opening time of the triennial, and the result was that a lot of people started digging in the beach. But the interesting thing is, what a lot of other metal was found, taken out. But ever since that time, people have continued now to make use of this bit of beach as leisure beach. So Michael's work, Folkstone Digs, has actually changed the way in which people use Folkestone's facilities, and it fits in the big picture. It fits in with an idea that Folkestone has to change in order to meet the future. It has to change from being a semi-industrial town to being a town which is based on creativity or culture, whose economy is based on creativity or culture. I think I'm going to stop there because I don't want to lose our opportunity for discussion and conversation. So thank you very much for listening so far, and I hope you've got some good questions for me.
Thank you for very interesting lecture, for so amazing ideas about cities, people,
yes.
Different effects. Can I ask two questions on Russia? Yes.
So you said that artists had to be validated. They had to see that they were in demand, that audience thinks their works are worthy. And the same is true about business. People do business and make something that will be in demand. So there must be some connection between art and culture and business. But then one thing is, maybe we shouldn't interfere business and art, even though there are many common things. And then I wanted to ask you about art support by the state, by the government. Should it be a continuous support, or maybe just once in a while and based on community and investors like worked with Creative Foundation?
Thank you. Yes, I take quite a wide view of culture. I think that business is a culture. Business is part of culture. So sport is part of culture. Business is part of. The important thing is not to think that culture is subordinate to business or business subordinate to culture. They are both part of the wider culture. So, but and the nature of culture is about humans relating to each other. So there is trading. All culture is trading. It's trading ideas. It's trading conversation. It's trading emotions. It's trading. All of culture is trading. So yes, business. The best business maybe is art too. I don't know, but anyway. Government, ideally, I think government would have nothing to do with art. I mean, I don't know. There's a bit of me that thinks we should all do without government, because governments get the wrong idea about. They think that they're there to govern us rather than there to represent our interests. Sometimes. But and so sometimes that makes me feel it would be better to do without them. But of course, actually, infrastructure is expensive. Civilization requires taxation in order to make it work. We all need healthcare. We all need, there are many roles for government, which are really beneficial. And where art sits, or culture more generally sits in that, as I just mentioned, I think sport is a form of culture. So we need government to provide us with arenas or with sports facilities, but maybe business could do that too. I don't know. I mean, I don't see any hard and fast rule. In Folkestone, we're very lucky to have a private businessman who's prepared to spend a lot of money on a place that he loves. That's how lucky is that? It's fantastic. Other places, there is no businessman, and so maybe collecting taxes and putting money into making the place better is the way to do it. Depends on the situation, I think. Is that an answer for...
You were saying that Folkstone is an art school, so basically you mean that people who grow up there and start their art lives as children, do you somehow consider employing them in the city after they just grow up there without getting any degree?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Liverpool Biennial went on, by the time I resigned from Liverpool Biennial, after 10 years, we were employing people who had first visited the Biennial as school children and had then volunteered to be interns or volunteers with the Biennial and had shown themselves to be excellent workers. And so we had then taken them on to be paid workers for the Biennial. So that was an opportunity for those people to gain the training and experience and knowledge that they needed to have a career with the Biennial without going anywhere else. And in Folkestone, I'm trying to do the same thing, working with colleagues with other arts organisations in Folkestone. We are very consciously keeping an eye out for which young people. It's like me sitting in the museum reading the books because I couldn't afford to buy them. I was picked up. I was given a job because I had proved that I cared. I was there. I turned up. And I want to give that same opportunity to young people now. And I know as an employer that it's really, really hard to find good people by advertising and interviewing them. It's much, much easier to get a good sense of who is going to be a good worker by watching them do it. So I'm very much in favor of internships or apprenticeships or you can go to university any time in your life. You can read a book any time in your life. You don't have to do it when you're 18 or whatever. 18 is a time for doing something. And so I would much rather take a school leaver and give them the opportunity to do something useful than wait until that person is 3 years older with a head full of theory. Sorry, I'm not a very good advertisement for the university system, am I? But I do think people should be educated, all the way through their lives, not only at the beginning. It's a terrible. People come out of university really overqualified for doing jobs which, don't demand very much theoretical knowledge or whatever. It's much better to get real experience and then read some books and get the theory as to how to deal with that real experience later. Sorry.
So you just said that art lives best when it's out in society, which means that you're kind of balancing between the freedom of art and the freedom of the public. And you're trying to find, that line, that border, where the freedom of art is not interfering with the freedom of public. You were showing these cases. Obviously, most of them have a very positive impact. I wonder, how do you do the risk assessment? How do you do, this questionnaire asking whether your art is provoking or it's hurting or it's some kind of, interfering the freedom of the public, and whether you had a very negative experience with that.
Yeah, I've had all kinds of experiences. I mean, there were lots of people who complained about the gold digging artwork. A lot of people complained about it. Not the people who were happily digging themselves, but the people who were watching from their windows, who didn't really want to see a lot of people between their windows and the sea. But who is right? I mean, they have a right to express their views also. There was another artwork which we had official complaints from the local government, because there are members of the local government who are United Kingdom Independence Party, the people who are very keen on the United Kingdom getting out of Europe, and they know what we're doing. They know that there is. I was accused in the Daily Telegraph of being a liberal curator. Liberal being the worst possible insult you can throw at anybody in the Daily Telegraph. Of course, there is a liberal agenda here. There's an agenda about helping people think for themselves. But a lot of people are against that. A lot of people are against that. But that's the same everywhere, isn't it? There are always going to be the whole the whole point about art is to reveal this multitude of different attitudes. And so I can't make a calculation about who is this going to hurt and who is this going to please, and which is better to do. Should I? Yes, we make risk assessments about physical injury and about professional reputation, and of course we make risk assessments, but in the end you have to believe in art to do its job, and also we know that that the unexpected happens, that something which you think may be wonderful turns out to be terrible, and something which you think is only so turns out to be a huge success. So I think it's really important to go with that sense of uncertainty and risk, rather than stopping short if you can't be certain. I think that's a bad way to go.
Thanks.
We have some people that have some hearing impairments, so this person wants to ask the question about deaf people. Have you met deaf people, and are there any opportunities for deaf people there?
Yes, I haven't actually worked with any deaf artists for Folkstone Triennial, but we did work with a deaf artist for Art TransPennine. There's an artist called Joseph Grigley, who's a very wonderful artist actually, who made an artwork in Manchester City Library. But in Folkestone we do. We do have guided tours for deaf people, so specifically organised with a sign language guide, so that deaf people can take advantage of the guided tours the same as everybody else. I mean, since we're on this subject and also talking about risk. It isn't always possible. I mean, there were some artworks which are not accessible to disabled people, for instance. And this is to do with Folkestone's geography and history, the fact that some places in Folkestone are not accessible, and so we have to take the decision: do we keep the exhibition away from these parts of the town, or do we allow the exhibition to go into those parts of the town in the knowledge that some people will not be able to get there. And it's a hard decision to make, but we've done both things. Sometimes we've said no, it's not. There's nothing to gain by doing that. Other occasions we have made artworks in places that are inaccessible, knowing that was what we were doing, but doing it anyway. And in fact, one of the most popular and successful works in the 2017 Triennial was entirely inaccessible. It was up some very steep steps. It was a burial ground, 18th century burial ground, which many people in Folkestone didn't know existed, and they were amazed and surprised to find it there. But people in wheelchairs couldn't possibly get there, unfortunately.
Добрый вечер. Меня зовут Денис.
Good evening. Good evening, my name is Denis. We also organize art festival in Viksa, a small town not far from Nizhny Novgorod, and also about 150,000 people live there. It's an industrial town, has lots of factories, but the same problems. People leave this place, and I wanted to ask you about art objects. For example, some art objects that we created were destroyed by local people, and not just once. It could happen 3 times or 4 times, because we wanted to restore them, and so we did it, but then they were destroyed or burnt or crushed or smashed. Do you provide insurance? Do you insure your objects? But some other objects were absolutely fine. They stayed there, but some objects were totally destroyed many times. So what do you do in terms of insurance? And have you ever had a situation when some objects were destroyed?
Well, actually in Folkestone we're very lucky. We tend, I wouldn't say there is no vandalism. We do have some vandalism, but it tends to be the artworks get attacked when somebody is attacking everything. So if they are tagging. They will tag the walls and the fences and the artworks. So then we clean the artworks, and it doesn't happen again for years or whatever. I mean, so we have no insurance against vandalism because the insurers wouldn't insure us. They refused, or it would be impossibly expensive for us to do it. So it's cheaper simply to mend the artwork each time it's damaged. But actually we have very little damage, only occasionally, as I say, when there is somebody who is damaging everything. And I think, I would like to think that the reason we don't have much damage is because many people who live there take care about the artwork. They like the artwork themselves, and they're looking from their window to see if other people are about to damage them or not. So there is a sense of the artwork being overlooked and cared for by people who live there. A lot. I don't have time to say everything, but many of the artworks are. I wouldn't say made with the participation, because actually we don't really do much in the way of physical production with local people, neighbours, but we do try to talk about what we're doing before it happens, and ask for people's opinions and explain why we're doing it the way we're doing it. And sometimes people are very negative, but then there's, and then other people are positive. But the negative people see some people being positive, and that keeps them quiet, or it makes them less angry. They're still angry, of course.
Дорогие друзья, последний вопрос остался, к сожалению.
Thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. My name is Yulia Mansurova. I have a short question. Speaking about that gold, has somebody found at least one piece of gold?
You don't believe it, do you?
Or maybe we still can go there and try our luck.
Please do. Yes, I mean, there were 7 people who told the press. They showed the press. They allowed themselves to be photographed with their piece of gold, and so we know that 7 of the 30 were found. We don't know where the other 23. Maybe all 30 were found, and the other 23 people were not admitting it, or maybe there are still 23 pieces there waiting to be found. But I have to say something else about this artwork, which is really interesting. Which is, if you find a piece of gold, what do you do then? Do you take it to the pawn shop and get the price of gold in today's exchange rate for rubles? Or do you take the gold home and you put it on your mantelpiece or in your cabinet and look at it as a souvenir and say, the value of this artwork is that I can look at it? Or do you take it to Christie's or Sotheby's, and if you take it to Christie's and sell it as art, then you get much more than the value of the gold. But you have to believe that it's art. Because you can't unless you believe it's art, then you don't believe that you can get the money from Christie's. So it kind of asks some interesting questions about your own belief in the artwork or not. We know that some people simply took it to the pawn shop and got the price of a holiday. So.
Thank you. Дорогие друзья, были очень рады вас видеть на нашем мероприятии. Ждем вас к нам в гости еще.
Thank you for coming, and let's thank our lecturer.
Thank you very much.